And good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner. Thank you for being here this afternoon. Thank you for the center for inviting me throughout the pandemic. I understand that everything is live now, so this is probably the last Zoom talk you get from me out of the New York area into the Boston area. So again, thank you for inviting me for the past 2.5 years, whatever that was. It is Italian American month, and Columbus Day the other day on Monday. And with that, I'm going to talk about one of my friends here, somebody else who I knew personally here, and some other very famous Italian Americans. But I have to start with my old buddy Yogi Berra. I realize I'm talking to a group in Boston, but I get the feeling that you up in the Boston area actually appreciate Yogi Berra because he was a national treasure. He was an icon, not only in baseball, but his yogiisms, his commercials, and all of that other stuff made him the lovable American icon that he ended up becoming and was throughout his life. That is me and Yogi. That's back in 2006 at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center at Montclair State University. And I used to speak there 3 or 4 times a year, and Yogi would come to most of my talks. He was always at the museum. All you had to do was hang out there and you'd see Yogi. And he used to, after I was done, pat me on the back, said, "Good job, kid, let's go eat." And we went into that back room and we ate and we talked. And one day he says to me, "You haven't asked me." I said, "What do you mean I haven't asked you?" He said, "You haven't asked me." I said, "What? About what?" He said, "Don't you want a yogiism?" I said, "No, I'm with you. We're hanging out. We're not, we're eating together. We're talking." I said, "If it comes out, it comes out." And he said, "No, I got to give you one." I said, "Okay, give me one." "Well, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying." It's not up there with, if you see a fork in the road, take it. But Yogi was famous for that type of thing. We're also going to talk about Joe DiMaggio, guy who I knew, and his brother, of course, played baseball with the Boston Red Sox. Frank Sinatra, who at one time was one of Joe's best buddies. Dean Martin, who was one of Frank's best buddies. Tony Bennett, who Frank called the best singer he ever heard. Connie Francis, who was the first lady of rock and roll for a little bit in the late 1950s. Frankie Valli, who's still out there, still performing. Last I looked, there was an announcement out of Baltimore that he's going to appear sometime in the spring in Baltimore, and he's about, 89 years old now. Madonna, who actually recorded part of the first album up in Boston. Lady Gaga, my daughter went to NYU with her, and she said that she was by far the most talented person in NYU. She was playing all the coffee houses in Greenwich Village and all. So there's Lady Gaga. Robert De Niro, who I went to a party with in 2010. Al Pacino, Sylvester Stallone, whose career was saved by Henry Winkler. John Travolta. Leonardo DiCaprio, who started his career on Romper Room, and the directors Frank Capra, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and the comedian from Boston, Jay Leno, and Lou Costello, who is in baseball's Hall of Fame, along with Yogi. But we start with Yogi, and eventually we are going to end with Yogi as well. Yogi didn't look like a baseball player. He's 5'8", if that much. I don't think he was that tall. And he just didn't, when he went to bat, he just swung at everything nearby. His childhood friend, Joe Garagiola, who I also knew, said that, you couldn't tell Yogi how to hit. Yogi just knew how to hit. It didn't matter where the ball was coming. He said, wherever the ball was, if Yogi thought he could hit it, he could hit it. And in the 1950s, Yogi was a big, big deal because he was in the World Series seemingly all the time. And not only that, he was on quiz shows, he was on comedies, and he was also in a lot of commercials. Ain't over until it's over. Well, there aren't too many people who remember Yogi Berra as a player anymore. After all, Yogi's last game was on May 9th, 1965, which was the day after his 40th birthday. His glory years in the 1950s. He seemed to be always on TV in October, catching when the World Series was played. And Yogi was in the 1950 and 51, 52, 53, 55, 57, 1958 versions of the Fall Classic. He was also there in 1949. He was also there in 1960, at 61, at 62, at 63, and as a manager in 1964. He jumped into Darren Larson's arms after the Yankee pitcher threw a perfect game in the 1956 World Series against the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was on game shows. He was on the Sergeant Bilko show. He became a TV pitchman, and I'll tell you about Bilko right now. One day, Yogi and I are sitting in the back office, and the Bilko show is known as the Bilko show, or You Never Get Rich, or the Phil Silver show, depending on syndication and whatever. And anyway, I was talking to him. I said, "You were on the Bilko show?" He said, "Yeah." I said, and the basic premise of that show was a whole bunch of New York Yankees are strolling through the base out in Fort Baxter out in Kansas. And I wanted to know, how did the New York Yankees end up at the Fort Baxter in Kansas? And he said, "No, we did it in the Bronx." I said, "Yeah, I know you did it in the Bronx. It was a studio in the Bronx." And he said, "But how'd you end up in Kansas?" He said, "No." He said, I got on the Garden State Parkway. We went on Route 4, went over the bridge, drove to Southern Boulevard in the Bronx. That time, I said, you know what? He's right. He was in the Bronx. I did not ask any more questions. That was Yogi. But he was on the Bilko show. And this book, I really didn't say everything I said, by Yogi Berra, which was really written by Dave Kaplan, who was running the museum at the time. Dave Kaplan, whose daughter covers hockey right now, I think for ESPN. But anyway, Yogi, I really didn't say everything I said. That's probably true. But let's go. It ain't over till it's over. He actually did say that to Mike Dyer. And at the end of this talk, I will tell you the circumstances behind that. Baseball is 90% mental. The other half is physical. I always thought that record would stand until it was broken. You can observe a lot by watching. If the world was perfect, it wouldn't be. About a St. Louis restaurant, although I heard it was about a Minneapolis restaurant, no one goes there anymore. It's too crowded. Guess you can't get a seat. I'm being honored in his hometown of St. Louis during his rookie season. I want to thank everybody for making this day necessary. Future ain't what it used to be. Hey, luggage, you want to buy luggage? Well, Yogi's got some advice. Why buy good luggage? You only use it when you travel. On his hitting approach, I can't think and hit at the same time. On economics, a nickel ain't worth a dime anymore. Oh, I did not go to Yogi's funeral. I was told, so many people are going to be there, watching on TV. We're going to stream it, and people are going to crowd in there. And even though I knew Yogi, there were so many acquaintances that everybody was going to fit into the church. But anyway, so he's not going to come to mine, because he once said, always go to other people's funeral. Otherwise, they won't come to yours, which reminds me of the story that I heard from his wife, Carmen. And Carmen is talking to Yogi about the final resting place. And Carmen says to Yogi, Yogi, grew up in St. Louis, played most of your career in the Bronx, and we live here in New Jersey. Where do you want to be buried? Surprise me. It's deja vu all over again. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. Yogi has been quoted in arguments before the United States Supreme Court more than anybody else in the history of the court. Yogi Berra. Yoo-hoo. I don't know how many people drank Yoo-hoo up in the Boston area. Garagiola once told me that with Yogi, in Yogi's case, he said Yogi lived in New Jersey, that if there was an oil gusher in New Jersey, Yogi would have stepped on it and would have made the money. He said Yogi had this uncanny ability to make money, and Yoo-hoo is a perfect example. There he is with Mickey Mantle, and I don't know if there's Yoo-hoo in there or it's chocolate mixed with vodka. Moose Skowron, the first baseman, who I really, really liked a lot. He had so many great stories, and he was a nice guy. And his Major League Baseball career was saved by Casey Stengel. He was a shortstop. Casey said, "You can't play shortstop, but you might be able to play first base. You have a good bat. I'm sending you to Arthur Murray Dance School." And Moose said he learned how to dance, learned how to play first base because of the footwork. And he said, "Look at me. My name is Moose, and look at what I look like, and I got the prettiest girl on the dance floor." Moose Skowron. And Elston Howard, the Yankee catcher. 1955, Yogi meets the Oliveri family, the people who put together Yoo-hoo. And it's at a New Jersey country club, probably the Montclair Country Club in 1955. And the Oliveris can't get the brand distributed. A&P's not taking it. Date Shopwell is not taking it. Those were the prominent stores in that area. So they figured, well, what do we have to lose? The worst thing, Yogi doesn't like it. So they hand him a bottle of Yoo-hoo, and he tasted the drink, and they're waiting, and they're hoping. And they said, "What do you think?" Next thing you know, Yogi is a member of the board. One time I was in the office and the phone rang, and when no one else was around, I always answer a ringing phone, so I did. The woman who was calling asked me if Yoo-hoo was hyphenated. So, no, ma'am, it's not even carbonated. He sold Kraft Italian dressing. He sold Prestolite high-level batteries. He sold Miller Light beer. He sold Shelby bicycles. And considering his career started in advertising in the 1950s, he was still going strong in the 21st century, selling insurance, the Aflac Duck. The last time I was with Yogi and hung out with Yogi was June 26th, 2011. Shortly afterwards, he fell. He was 86 years old at the time. And unfortunately, I really didn't have a chance to be with him after that. So, but I valued my sort of friendship with Yogi Berra. He was a very, very nice guy. Now, he had a teammate in New York by the name of Joe DiMaggio. And Joe DiMaggio came from San Francisco, and there are the DiMaggio brothers. Vince DiMaggio is to the left, the right of Joe D. And Dominic DiMaggio, who I really liked. He was a gentleman. He was a smart guy. He was a gentleman. And maybe he should be in Baseball Hall of Fame. Maybe he shouldn't be. That's not for me to say. But he was a really good guy. And he was the antithesis of Joe, who was very quiet and reserved and kept to himself and really wasn't a social butterfly, whereas Dominic was. In fact, 4 years ago, I was in San Francisco, and I was in at the San Francisco Wharf walking around, and I look up, and it's the Dominic DiMaggio building. That's where the family had their fish restaurant. And I looked at my wife, and I said, I knew Dominic DiMaggio before he was a building. Very nice guy. But I'm here talking about Joe, not necessarily Dominic, the little general who played with the Boston Red Sox in the 1940s. Joe D, San Francisco to New York. Joe DiMaggio played for the hometown San Francisco Seals of the minor league Pacific Coast League between 1932 and 1935. On November 21st, 1934, the Yankees traded 4 players and money to the Seals for DiMaggio. DiMaggio joined the Yankees in 1936 in 13 seasons. His teams won 10 American League pennants and 9 World Series. He was voted in 1969 the game's greatest living player. And as a side note, there's this old story that the Red Sox and Yankees general managers once were talking about, well, what happens if we trade Joe D for Ted Williams? Well, it would have been terrible for the Red Sox because Joe D quit in 51. And Ted Williams would play for another 8 years after that, 52 through 1960. He was the Yankee Clipper. Ernest Hemingway, put him in The Old Man and the Sea book. He was celebrated in song, and he was also celebrated for his marriage to Marilyn Monroe. One day I said to Yogi, I asked Yogi, I said, did you ever go out with Marilyn and Joe? He said, yeah. He said, Carmen come with you? Yeah. So what'd you talk about? I said, I don't remember. Nobody talked. Sounds right. Anyway, I guarantee you that cigarette that Joe has in his hands, he didn't pay for. That drink in front of him, he didn't pay for. And if there was a meal, he wasn't going to pay for it. Phil Rizzuto, the Yankee shortstop, celebrated when he retired in 1951, Joe D retiring, saying, thank God I don't have to pay for his meals anymore. Joe was cheap. As Phil once said, he had short arms and long pockets, and I guess Rizzuto kept some of the money. DiMaggio retired after the 1951 season. 1952, he asked a friend of his, arrange a dinner with Marilyn Monroe for me, and they did, and they fell in love. And on January 14th, 1954, Joe D and Marilyn eloped in San Francisco. 9 months later, Marilyn Monroe filed for divorce, citing only mental cruelty. I was around a lot of Yankees who played in the 50s, 60s, 70s, back in the day when I was breaking in the 1980s. And they said mental cruelty was only the tip of the iceberg over there. But again, it's only hearsay. This is what broke up Joe and Marilyn. That is actually Stamford, Connecticut. The year is 2017. It's 6 years ago. And that's 26-foot Marilyn Monroe, a sculpture that travels the country every year. Ended up in Stamford, Connecticut in 2017. And behind there is a church, and you might be able to pick out the First Congregational Church name on the building. And anyway, the parishioners would come out. The first thing they would see is the back of Marilyn's skirt flipped up. And to my left in that picture, to Marilyn's left, to your right is another church. And the parishioners in Stamford were complaining, couldn't you put this statue somewhere else? You know, it's kind of disrespectful. First thing you walk out of the church, you see is Marilyn's derriere, 26-foot Marilyn. But Stamford officials said, nope, it stays there. And it stayed there all summer. DiMaggio walked onto the set of 7-Year Itch, and he got aggravated in a second. He was dismayed at the sight of his wife on exhibit for more than 2,000 strangers. What the hell is going on here? Well, they went home that night and something happened because literally the next day, Marilyn filed for divorce. Shortly after the highly publicized event, the divorce papers are filed, but that's not the end of the story. There is more to that story coming up. Oh, you have probably heard this song tens of thousands of times since 1968. It is Mrs. Robinson, written by Paul Simon, Simon and Garfunkel. This is the 45. Remember, they used to come out with 45s, Old Friends and Bookends. Joe and song, Mrs. Robinson, which started out as Mrs. Roosevelt. It was supposed to be an homage to Eleanor Roosevelt or to Ted Williams. Paul Simon was not exactly sure which one of those two would fit the story, and then he decided on DiMaggio. We Didn't Start the Fire, that's Billy Joel. Joltin' Joe, Les Brown and his band of renown. Now, a couple stories I have heard over the years, and the Paul Simon story on Dick Cavett. Now, the story I have heard over the years is that Joe goes out to dinner with Paul Simon. Paul, of course, is going to pay for this. And he says something like, what do you mean? Where have I gone? I'm here. I'm with you. I'm doing commercials. You know, I got the car. I got all this going on. I haven't gone anywhere. And Paul Simon decides to go intellectual, which, when you were dealing with Joe, was not exactly the thing that you'd want to do, going intellectual. But Paul Simon did go intellectual. He said, Paul Simon, he said that I didn't mean the lines literally. That I thought of him as an American hero and that genuine heroes were in short supply. He accepted the explanation, thanked me, we shook hands and said goodnight. That's the quote he gave to Dick Cavett. From what I have heard over the years about the meeting was that Paul Simon went intellectual. Joe said, what do you mean? Where have I gone? I'm here. And Paul Simon said, well, no. In 1951, you retired. I was 10 years old. I never, ever saw you again. And you were like Eleanor Roosevelt. You were like Ted Williams. You were a genuine American hero. Well, there is Paul Simon. There is Dick Cavett. Uh, Joe DiMaggio and Mickey Mantle hated one another. Absolutely hated one another. 1951, Mickey comes up. He's 20 years old. He's gorgeous. He's blonde. He is chiseled. His name, Mantle, comes out of the ground. And Joe was jealous. He's a broken down, old 37-year-old player with a bad heel, and he can't really do all that much anymore. So it's the World Series 1951. Joe already has a dislike for Mickey simply because he's Mickey. And there's a fly ball. It's the World Series 1951. Yankees and the New York Giants. Fly ball hit to right center field. And Mantle could fly in those days. He had enormous speed, and he's running in and running in, trying to get to the ball. And he trips over a drain, tears up his knee. And he hated DiMaggio after that because he said Joe loafed on the ball. And so Dick Cavett knows the story, and he wants to know the backstory of Mrs. Robinson. And Cavett asks him, well, why did you use Joe? Why didn't you use Mickey? And Paul Simon responded, it's all about syllables, Dick. It's about how many beats there are. Joe DiMaggio just sounds a lot better than Mickey Mantle. By the way, Mickey Mantle was in a Paul Simon video, me and Julio down by the schoolyard. There he is, Mr. Coffee. He sold you coffee. In the 1970s, he became the spokesman for Mr. Coffee and was the face of the electronic drip coffee makers for 20 years. 1972, there was a bank here in New York called the Bowery Savings Bank. The building where the Bowery first opened up is still there. It looks like a magnificent old building from the 19th century down on the Bowery and Grand Street. Anyway, DiMaggio became a spokesman for the Bowery Savings Bank, except for a 5-year hiatus. In the 1980s, he regularly made commercials for the Bowery Savings Bank until 1992. Terry Cashman, Dennis, baseball balladeer. Terry pitched minor league baseball for 2 years with the Detroit Tigers organization, went into music, wrote some songs, and also was Jim Croce's producer back, obviously prior to Croce's demise in a plane crash in 1973. Dennis, or Terry, and we share the same periodontist. I've known Terry for a long time. Wrote a song, bunch of songs. Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, Talking Baseball, Terry Cashman. And if you look at the sleeve of that 45, you see Duke Snider, you see Willie Mays, you see Mickey Mantle. Somebody is missing. Somebody who's missing is Joe DiMaggio. He is in the original picture. It was Old Timers Day at Shea Stadium back in the 70s, and the Mets honored the great center fielders of New York in the 1950s, well, 40s also. Duke, Willie, and Mickey, and that became the song. Joe runs into Terry one day, and he says, how come I'm not in the song? Talking Baseball, Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, a 1981 song written and performed by Terry Cashman. Joe DiMaggio was in the photograph, but he was left out of the song and airbrushed out of the record picture, or the from the record picture sleeve. And the deal was pretty simple. Why am I not in the song? And Terry said, well, Terry's born 1941. He said, well, these are the guys I remember from the 1950s. And Joe accepted that. He said, you're right. He said he played 1950 and 51, but they certainly weren't Hall of Fame years for Joe DiMaggio. They were a guy who was at the end of the line, and he accepted that. Fast friends once, Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra. Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra were two men of the same generation who probably did more than anyone else of their time to bring Italian Americans into the mainstream of America's popular culture. 1935, Francis Albert Sinatra became a part of the Hoboken Four. The group was featured on Major Bowes' Amateur Hour, NBC Radio, and they won first prize. They got a 6-month contract to perform on stage and radio across the U.S. Now, In the New York area, when I do the talk about the Hoboken Four, the Hoboken Four, I talk about how me and Sinatra have one thing in common: WNEW radio. That is Major Bowes behind them, and Frank is on the right, at the end on the right. 1938, Sinatra was a singing waiter at the roadhouse called the Rustic Cabin, Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, right about 3 miles north of where you get off on the George Washington Bridge on Route 4. He was paid $15 a week. The roadhouse was connected to WNEW radio, and here's the only thing Sinatra and I have in common. I worked at WNEW between 1978, March of 1978, thanks to breaking a story that John Lindsay, the former mayor of New York City, was running for New York Senate. And I stayed there until 1981, and he was heard on WNEW, and that was his big break. I was 21 at the time. I was heard on WNEW, and Sinatra was probably also about 21. Anyway, WNEW, New York City, and he began performing with a group live during the Dance Parade show, which was heard on WNEW. In June, the band leader, Harry James, heard Sinatra sing on WNEW, the Dance Parade, signed him to a 2-year, $75 a week deal. It was with the James Band that Sinatra released his first commercial record, From the Bottom of My Heart, in July. Didn't go anywhere. 8,000 copies of the record were sold, and he did release a couple more records through 1939, such as All or Nothing at All. Didn't go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere at all. The country was not ready for Frank Sinatra yet. But he would go to the Dorsey Brother Band, Tommy Dorsey. In November 1939, James left to replace Jack Leonard as the lead singer of the Tommy Dorsey Band. In his first year with Dorsey, Sinatra recorded over 40 songs. Sinatra's first vocal hit was the song Polka Dots and Moonbeams in late April 1940. I'll Never Smile Again topped the charts for 12 weeks beginning in July of 1940. Sinatra pushed Dorsey, let me do some solo songs. Dorsey originally said no. Eventually Dorsey said, yeah, okay. And on January 19th, 1942, Sinatra recorded Night and Day. Now, Cole Porter was the writer of Night and Day. He also wrote I've Got You Under My Skin, and he did not appreciate Frank Sinatra's recordings of his records. He basically said he's emotionless. Now, my wife went to Juilliard. She was on Broadway and a singer and all that. And I said, what do you think? And she listened back to Night and Day. She listened back to I've Got You Under My Skin. And she says, those are really emotional songs. And she said, it kind of sounds good, but it really doesn't bring out the best of Cole Porter's lyrics. And that's what Cole Porter was thinking. Oh, the Bobby Soxers. The Bobby Soxers were a key element of Frank Sinatra's success. After the 1942 recording, Sinatra believed he needed to go solo, but he was hampered by his contract, which gave Dorsey 43% of Sinatra's lifetime earnings in the entertainment industry. Sinatra died in 1998. He's still making money in the 1990s, which meant 55 years later, Dorsey was going to get 43% of whatever Sinatra did in 1998 or released. Anyway, a legal battle ensued, eventually settled in August 1942. On September 3rd, 1942, Dorsey said, goodbye, Frank, and reportedly said as Sinatra left the air, I hope you fall on your ass. But he was more gracious on the air when replacing Sinatra with the singer Dick Haymes. By May 1941, Sinatra topped the male singer polls in Billboard and Downbeat magazines, his appeal to Bobby Soxers, teenage girls. And that opens up a whole new audience for popular music, which at that point was recorded like all the Jolson stuff and the others, Rudy Valley, those are the two big ones, and then came Bing Crosby, mainly for adults up to that time. The Bobby Soxers organized meetings, sent masses of letters of adoration, Sinatra's publicist, George Evans, encouraged interviews and photographs with fans and created his image as an Italian American with a rough childhood who made good. But by the time Frank Sinatra is about 31 years old, he's a has-been, gone. You know, people don't last long in this business. It's why a lot of singers tried to make it in the movies. He's gone. It took him a long time, about 7 years, to get back to the top. From Here to Eternity, the movie did that. He's the king of the hill, top of the heap. The release of the movie From Here to Eternity, August 1953, marked the beginning of a career revival. He would be nominated for Academy Awards. His records were big sellers in the 1950s. He had a TV show on ABC, Paramount ABC. So he's back on top, and his friend Joe is having some problems with his marriage. In fact, he's having more than problems. Marilyn has asked for a divorce at this time. So Frank decides, you know what? Me and Joe, we're tight like that. We're going to go, I'm going to help him out. I am going to help him out and whatever I can in this divorce. Well, this is what happens. Joe D and Frank would have a fallout because of this. Sinatra just hired a private investigator, a guy by the name of Barney Ruditsky, to trail Ava Gardner, his great obsession and soon to be his ex-wife. Sinatra offered the same services to DiMaggio. Let's follow Marilyn Monroe. He also had Monroe's phone bugged. He's not a government guy. You know, he's not a law enforcement guy. Yet somehow he gets Marilyn's phone bugged. When Marilyn moves into the Waldorf Astoria, Park Avenue in Manhattan, which now is being turned into a condo, anyway, DiMaggio would wear a fake beard and hold the New York Times over half his face while he sat in the lobby for hours, waiting for a glimpse of her, hoping to catch her in the act. They're divorced by this point. They're divorced. One night, or actually they're separated. They're not quite divorced. They're separated. One night after a bout of drinking, Sinatra and DiMaggio, along with 5 others, went over to an apartment complex in West Hollywood, California, November 1954. DiMaggio knew that Monroe was carrying on with her voice coach, a guy by the name of Hal Schaefer. He wanted to catch them in the act and cause a little pain. And he's got Frank to help him out, and 5 other guys. A 39-year-old woman by the name of Florence Kotz awoke to find her door broken down and Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra hovering over her, ready to pounce. She screamed. The cops came. They got 5 guys, but there were 7 altogether. There were 2 guys left out of their official report, Frank Sinatra and Joe DiMaggio. Florence Kotz later sued Joe DiMaggio, Frank Sinatra, and the other 5 for $200,000, which today would be about $1.4 million. Well, Sinatra pulled $7,500 out of his pocket and gave her the money and told her to go away and keep quiet. And it was kept quiet for a little bit, but there was, the confidential was basically a rag sheet. It was a Hollywood tabloid who looked to find dirt on every celebrity, including Desi Arnaz and Rock Hudson and a whole bunch of others. So Confidential broke the story. They called it the wrong door raid. But for the rest of his life, DiMaggio said, I wasn't there. I don't know. I knew nothing about it. He never talked to Sinatra after that. So you be the judge. Frank and Dean, 2/4 or 2/5 of the Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Playboy, called him the coolest man who ever lived. Elvis Presley worshipped him. He was the coolest dude I've ever seen, period, recalled singer and actor Stevie Van Zandt. He just wasn't great at everything he did. To me, he was perfect. But he was far from perfect as about a 28, 29-year-old guy in June 1946, when he and Jerry Lewis shared the bill for the first time at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, New Jersey. They combined their acts into a combo of comedy and music, which saw the birth of a phenomenon. They were the hottest ticket around in the late 1940s going into the early 1950s and parlayed their onstage success into a string of hit movies and television appearances. They split in 1956. Dino Crucchetti delivered bootleg liquor, served as a speakeasy croupier and a blackjack dealer, worked in a steel mill, was a boxer, Kid Crochet, in his hometown of Steubenville, Ohio. Dean's speakeasy experience put him in contact with club owners, resulting in his first singing gigs. He became Dean Martin, styling himself after Harry Mills or the Mills Brothers. One thing about that, if you have YouTube, go up to YouTube, look up Dean Martin, the Mills Brothers from the Dean Martin Show. And Dean he's got to be about 50 years old by this point. Harry Mills is singing. And he is like a kid in the candy store singing with his hero, Harry Mills. He meets Sinatra in New York in the mid 1940s. And he meets this guy, Jerry Lewis, in 1945. Jerry Lewis, just 20 years old. And so it's March of 1945. They're in the streets, they're introduced, they became friends, they performed individually at the Glass Hat Club in Manhattan and would heckle each other. In late July 1946, Jerry was booked to play the Club 500 in Atlantic City. There was a singer by the name of Jack Randall who was scheduled to appear with Jerry on the bill, but he never showed up. Recalling the times he goofed around with Dean, Jerry went to the club's owner, Paul Skinny D'Amato. Told him, hire Dean, take his place. We fool around on stage, Jerry assured them. We do funny stuff together, except they never did. They heckled each other, but they never, ever fooled around together on stage. Dean was unemployed at the time, flew in, took the gig. That night, July 25th, 1946, Dean sang a few songs, went off stage. Jerry did his record act, did the same. And there was Skinny D'Amato waiting for them in the dressing room. And there were no smiles on Dean and Jerry's face. D'Amato, a sinister, slightly sinister, gangsterish type, calls him into the office. Where's the funny stuff? Dean and Jerry were stuck for an answer. There better be some funny stuff in the next show, or else. Now, what could that or else be? Well, they're in Atlantic City, Steel Pier, Atlantic. Oh, they could put us in cement shoes and have us take that final walk. So they have to come up with something for the midnight show. And they had to produce. The two retreated to their dressing room. Both Dean and Jerry were starving. They didn't have time to eat earlier. And they told the club's busboy, get us some pastrami sandwiches and some sodas. And so they're beginning to eat. And Jerry starts writing down what would be the genesis of the Martin and Lewis act on the wrapper of his pastrami sandwich as the showtime grew nearer. He had had an idea in the back of his mind for several months. He called it Sex and Slapstick. His idea, pair a handsome, confident man with, as he put it, a monkey. And the rest is history. The organ grinder and the monkey, well, within 2 weeks, the hottest thing in showbiz. They would split up in 1956 at the Copacabana in New York, July 25th, 56, 10 years after they first had taken the stage together. The biggest act, and Jerry claimed they left millions of dollars on the table by splitting up. Martin felt that Jerry was exerting too much control over their work, and he wanted to go back to his solo career. Of course, he didn't have much of a solo career before Jerry Lewis. Neither did Jerry Lewis. Lewis, who idolized Martin, felt betrayed. I broke up the act, he told People magazine in 2002. Dean hurt desperately, and I felt guilty of not seeing it sooner. And there is Dean, and there's life after Jerry, and the life is good. As a solo act, he was wowing crowds in Vegas, impressing critics and audiences in a series of dramatic film roles, scoring on TV with The Dean Martin Show and Comedy Roast on NBC, and hitting the charts again with Return to Me and Volare. Though he left Capitol to sign with Sinatra's fledgling Reprise label, Martin kept his tenure there with a bang, releasing 2 classic singles. Ain't that a kick in the head? And you're nobody till somebody loves you. That was the height of his powers, those records. And of course, he ends up with these guys, the Rat Pack. There's Frank, there's Dean, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and the comedian of that particular picture, Joey Bishop. Well, if Joey wasn't there, it would be Johnny Carson. So they were interchangeable. Not soon after, Martin's affiliation with Sinatra, Sammy, and the rest of the Rat Pack supplanted his earlier reputation. He fueled his image as a boozing playboy in onstage antics with his pals in the ring-a-ding ensemble films like Ocean's 11. Yet Martin later claimed his cocktail-swilling persona was largely a pose, an orange juice or apple juice. At the height of their appeal, in a very small room, in the 1960s, they packed 34,000 people over a 4-week period at the Sands Hotel and Casino to see their swagger, antics, and camaraderie. Tony Bennett. Frank Sinatra said Tony Bennett was the best. In 1949, Bob Hope noticed a young singer working with Pearl Bailey in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, New York City. Bob Hope came down to check out my act. He liked my singing so much that after the show, he came back to see me in my dressing room and said, "Come on, kid, you're going to come to the Paramount and sing with me." But first, he told me he didn't care for my stage name, Joe Barry. He asked me, "What's your real name?" I told him, "My name is Anthony Dominic Benedetto." And he said, "We'll call you Tony Bennett." There is some hope. Frank Sinatra was wowed by Tony Bennett. For my money, Tony Bennett's the best singer in the business. He excites me when I watch him. He moves me. He's a singer who gets across what the composer has had in mind, and probably a little more. I don't know what Cole Porter thought of Tony Bennett, but I do know what Cole Porter thought of Frank Sinatra. Didn't like him. The success of the Columbia hits in the 1950s, Because of You, Rags to Riches, Cold, Cold Heart, I Want to Be Around to Pick Up the Pieces, The Good Life, Who Could I Turn to When Nobody Needs Me, and the signature song, I Left My Heart in San Francisco. He got 2 Grammys for that. Oddly enough, Frank tried that song, and that song went absolutely nowhere. He reinvented his career. There he is with Lady Gaga. My daughter went to NYU with Lady Gaga back 20 years ago or so. And she said everybody knew she was the star. She played coffee houses and alike and had the talent. After a near fatal cocaine overdose in 1979, Tony Bennett called his sons Danny and Day looking for help. "Look, I'm lost here. It seems like people don't want to hear the music I make." Danny Bennett was an aspiring musician, and he comes to a realization. The band Danny and his brother had started, Quacky Duck and His Barnyard Friends. Sounds like it should be for Sesame Street or some other educational show, had struggled, and Danny's musical abilities were limited. However, he discovered during that time that he had a head for business. His father, on the other hand, well, he had that tremendous musical talent, but he had no idea what to do financially. So Danny signed on as his father's manager. They set up a studio, I guess it's in Tenafly, New Jersey, where I was the other day, and they did recordings over there, Danny's studio. Danny got his father's business expenses, all of his expenses, under control, moved him back to New York, began booking him in colleges and small theaters to get away from a Las Vegas image. It started about 1979, 1980. I graduated college in 77. I probably would have gone to see Tony Bennett, although at that time I had tickets in my hand to see Frank Sinatra in Queens, New York. And I'm 23. That's not cool for a 23-year-old to go see Frank, and I never did. And all these years later, I'm kicking myself saying, I could have seen Frank Sinatra. He wasn't at his best at that point, but he was still Frank Sinatra. After some effort, a successful plan to pay back the IRS debt was put into place. He reunited with Ralph Sharon as his pianist and musical director. By 1986, Tony Bennett was re-signed to Columbia Records, this time with creative control and released the Art of Excellence. And this became his first album to reach the charts since 1972. Danny did a good job. He got Tony Bennett on The Simpsons. Simpsons, that's a place where George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and a whole bunch of others also made appearances. Danny Bennett felt younger audiences who were unfamiliar with his father would respond to his music if given a chance. Danny began regularly to book his father on Late Night with David Letterman, a show with a younger, hip audience. That would be in the 1980s. And a lot of those people now are about ready to go on Medicare. This was subsequently followed by appearances on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, The Simpsons, Muppets Tonight for the Young Kids, various MTV programs. He worked with K.D. Lang and Aretha Franklin and Willie Nelson and Queen Latifah and Lady Gaga. He appeared on stage singing I'm in the New York State of Mind with Billy Joel. Danny Bennett was absolutely correct. Given the chance, his dad would be beloved by generations. And he was, until he passed away recently. Connie Francis, who's sorry now? She was encouraged by her father. She was musical from the start, and at the age of 4, gave her first concert at the Olympic Amusement Park in Irvington, New Jersey, where she played the accordion and sang Anchors Away. She then appeared on TV for 1 year on Marie Moser's Starlet program at Newark, New Jersey, when there was a commercial TV station licensed to Newark. At the age of 10, she was playing the accordion and singing St. Louis Blues on Ted Mack's Amateur Hour show. She was also on the Arthur Godfrey Talent Scouts. I'm going to divert here for 1 second. The story is Arthur Godfrey fired Julius LaRosa, and the old timers remember it well. Today, nobody knows about it, but I did know Julie. He worked at WNEW when I was there. I was there when I was 21, and Julie didn't have to talk to me. He used to sing national anthems at Shea Stadium, and we'd watch baseball games together because I was covering baseball. And he told me that there was miscommunication between him and Arthur Godfrey on the radio show, and it appeared that Arthur fired him. Julius said, I was leaving. I got a big head. I thought I could be a big star, and I just left. Julius was the nicest guy I ever met in radio. I mean, he was just a sweetheart and a nice guy and all of that. And he was the only entertainer to visit Arthur Godfrey on his deathbed. Julius LaRosa, who ended up in Palm Springs, California, along with Jerry Vale, and was a member of the prestigious club, the Romeos, retired old men eating out. Connie Francis was on the NBC TV, the StarTime Kids show, for 4 years, between 1950 and 1954. There she is, a young girl playing the accordion. At the age of 17, when the television show StarTime left the air, George Sheck and his music publisher, Lou Levy, put up $6,000 for her very own recording session. Every label turned them down. Mitch Miller, remember Sing Along with Mitch? Lived up in Rockland County on Route 202. Anyway, not far from where I was when I was living in Rockland County. Anyway, he was the guy, he was in charge of basically artists and relations at Columbia Records, and he told both of them, save your money, boys. She sounds like 50,000 other girls. But the last company to which Sheck peddled her new recordings, MGM, headed by Harry Meyerson, signed her to a 2-year deal. Who's sorry now? Well, initially, maybe MGM, but Dick Clark, who was not exactly the cleanest guy during the payola days. Ellen Freed took the fall for all the disc jockeys. Dick Clark somehow skirted any dirtiness, but his hands were filthy back in those days. Anyway, Who's Sorry Now was released in October 1957, and like all of her previous records, it went nowhere. Connie thought she would turn to secretarial work and utilize the Gregg shorthand she mastered at the age of 13, basically to prevent her mother from snooping in her diary. But on January 1st, 1958, on American Bandstand, Dick Clark played the song over and over and over, again and again and again. and it would sell about 1 million copies. She became the first lady of rock and roll. And then she embarked on a nonstop mission to embrace and conquer the world. She maintained a frenetic pace filled with recording albums and appearances on every prestigious TV and variety show, filming movies, making concert appearances in all major capitals of the world on 5 continents. In 1959, she became the biggest selling female recording artist in German history. 1959, 1960, her first foreign language albums in Italian, Hebrew, Spanish remained on the charts for almost a year, and her contract with MGM called for making 5 albums per year. But she would have some real problems after her initial success. She had bad marriages. 1967, she underwent cosmetic surgery, which left her unable to sing in air-conditioned venues. Depressed and suffering a miscarriage in 1974, her husband, Joe Garzilli, encouraged her get back to singing, and she did. She's booked into an engagement or series of engagements at the Westbury Music Fair, Nassau County on Long Island. On the 4th night of the engagement, November 8th, she was raped, robbed, and beaten. She went into seclusion for 7 years. The suspect still at large 49 years later. 1983, in July, she was involuntarily committed by her father to a mental institution and was incorrectly diagnosed with manic depression. She was involuntarily committed in those hospitals 17 times in the next 9 years in 5 different states until February 1991 in New York, in New Jersey, Florida, California, and Texas. In 1989, she resumed her recording and performing career. In 2010, Connie Francis and Mental Health America launched a national campaign on the importance of stress and trauma in the development of mental health problems and the need to appropriately treat them in order for people to get better. Hey, you could probably see him in the next year. Frankie Valli, he is still out there. 88, 89 years old. Actually, Herb Alpert's 88 years old. He's still out there. Johnny Mathis, about 87. He's still out there. All these guys are still out there, still trying to perform and make people happy. When Frankie Valli was 7 years old, his mother took him to New York City's Paramount Theater to see Frank Sinatra. I saw Sinatra coming out on stage. The way it was lit up, it was like he had an aura around him. I decided then and there, that's what I'm going to do, be a successful singer. 1953, he does capture the eye of a music publisher by the name of Paul Kapp, who helped him make his first record, My Mother's Eyes, on the Corona label, but the song did nothing, sank without a trace, may have sold some copies in Newark, New Jersey, his hometown. In the early 1950s, Tommy DeVito headed a group called the Variety Trio. He added Valli in 1954, and the Four Lovers was chosen as the group's name. Now, they do get on Ed Sullivan, 1956, singing You're the Apple of My Eye by Otis Blackwell, a guy who wrote songs for Elvis. The Four Lovers also cut an album called Joyride, appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. Well, the Four Lovers would become the Four Seasons eventually. But it's kind of an interesting story how they became the Four Seasons. And it's a New Jersey story. This can only happen in New Jersey. You got to know New Jersey to understand why this can only happen in New Jersey. The Four Lovers became the Four Seasons by 1962. In 1960, the Four Lovers flunked an audition to play at the flunked an audition to play at the cocktail lounge of a bowling alley in Union, New Jersey, but they decided the lounge's name would make a classy moniker for a singing group, the Four Seasons. They were not good enough to sing at a bowling alley. They couldn't sing at a bowling alley. That's how bad they were. But they continued. Oh, that's the bowling alley. Bowling alley today is now a Costco. The Four Seasons bowling alley torn down 1998, and Costco is there right now. There was one guy in the group, Bob Gordio from Bergenfield, New Jersey, and he and Frankie were best of pals and partners. 1962, Bob Gaudio came up with a song that made full use of Frankie's remarkable range, from baritone to falsetto. When the Seasons sang Sherry on American Bandstand, he suddenly became the hottest band in the land, and after 9 years as a recording artist, Frankie Valli became an overnight sensation with a #1 record. Gaudio collaborated with Bob Crewe. This is what they came up with: Big Girls Don't Cry, Walk Like a Man, Dawn Go Away, Ronnie, Ragdoll, Save It For Me, Big Man in Town, Bye Bye Baby Goodbye. And Frankie goes solo in 1967 with the song Can't Take My Eyes Off You. It was in 1967, the song went to #2 on the Billboard charts, #1 in Cashbox. Can't Take My Eyes Off You has become one of the top 10 most played songs in the history of BMI, one of the two major companies that collect royalties for songwriters. Frankie had a really good solo career, stayed with the Four Seasons. They had songs like Come On, Marianne, Watch the Flowers Grow, and the Carole King song, Will You Love Me Tomorrow? From 1962 to 78, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons sold more than 100 million records. And there's more. The Jersey Boys. It's a musical about the formation, success, and eventual breakup of the 1960s rock and roll group, the Four Seasons. Jersey Boys won Tony Award for Best Musical, the Laurence Olivier Award for Best New Musical, and Grammy Award for the Best Musical Show Album. The musical premiered at the La Jolla Playhouse outside of San Diego in California in 2004 and ran on Broadway from 2005 to 2017, and there have been American and international tours. Madonna, there's Madonna. Madonna was a member of the National Honor Society. She's a very, very, very smart woman. She doesn't have much in terms of a voice, as a Bostonian, Gary LaForest, once told me about 20 years ago, who knew about Madonna's initial recordings in Boston. In 1978, Madonna Louise Ciccone dropped out of college and relocated to New York. She was not an overnight success. In fact, it took her many years. Gary LaForest, who I was supposed to work together with on a magazine called The New Frontier, done by Kenny O'Donnell, JFK's chief of staff, daughter Helen O'Donnell, but we never got off the ground. That's another story entirely. But he told me, he was around, she had no voice, and her records reflected that. Her voice had to be layered and layered and layered and layered. Over the years, she's been accused of lip syncing in her concerts. By January 1984, Madonna gained more exposure by performing on American Bandstand and in England on Top of the Pops. Her image, performances, and music videos influenced young girls and women. Madonna's style became one of the female fashion trends of the 1980s. She was a shrewd marketer. She sold an image and continues to sell an image. And there she is. The original image, created by stylist and jewelry designer Maripol. The look consisted of lace tops, skirts over capri pants, fishnet stockings, jewelry bearing the crucifix, bracelets, and bleached hair. Madonna's popularity continued to rise globally with the release of her second studio album, Like a Virgin, in November 1984. In April 1985, Madonna embarked on her first concert tour in North America, the Virgin Tour. The tour saw the peak of Madonna wannabe phenomenon, with many female attendees dressing like her. She had two more hits, Angels and Dress You Up. She had 4 singles from the album peak inside the top 5 on the Hot 100 chart. She would go on to become an actress. Dick Tracy, League of Their Own. She's not much of an actress. She knew it. Eventually, she went back on tour, headlined the 2012 Super Bowl halftime show. Lady Gaga has talent. She legitimately has talent. Stephanie Joanne Angelina Germanotta, or Lady Gaga, rose to prominence in 2007, her first album, The Fame, and it had 2 hits, Just Dance and Poker Face. She ventured into acting, playing leading roles in 2015-2016 miniseries American Horror Story Hotel. She received a Golden Globe Award for Best Actress and she was in A Star is Born, the remake of the old Star is Born movie and Evergreen and all that. And she would team up with this guy, Tony Bennett. September 2014, Gaga released a collaborative jazz album with Tony Bennett titled Cheek to Cheek. The inspiration behind the album came from her friendship with Tony Bennett and fascination with jazz music since her childhood. Before the album was released, it had 2 hits, Anything Goes and I Can't Give You Anything But Love. She was in A Star is Born. Among the contributions to the Star is Born soundtrack was her hit, Shallow. She was the first woman to win an Academy Award, a BAFT Award, Golden Globe Award, and Grammy Award in 1 year. She would go back to her dance pop roots with a studio album, her 6th, Chromatica, in 2020. She had the #1 hit, Rain On Me. And then there was the 2nd album with Tony Bennett, the last one Tony Bennett did with her, Love for Sale. And there was also a starring role in the biopic House of Gucci, all in 2021. I was at a party with Robert De Niro, St. Regis Hotel in Midtown Manhattan in 2012, April 14th, 2010. And my wife got to hang out with Jamie Foxx, the First Lady of Malaysia, some African clothes designer, and she got to boogie all night long. And I got to hang out with this guy, Senator Pothole himself, the former New York Senator Alphonse D'Amato. All night, not only with him, but with his brother Armin. And not only that, he took out his wallet and out popped a whole bunch of pictures of his little kid. See, I made the mistake in 1980, when I was 23 years old, of giving Alphonse D'Amato his first ever interview outside in New York State of Long Island when he was running for Senate, and he never forgot it, and to this day still doesn't forget. Robert De Niro gained stardom for his uncompromising portrayals of violent and abrasive characters, and later in his career for his comic depictions of cranky old men. Now, he studied at the Stellar Adler Conservatory of Acting. Stellar Adler is one of my relatives. The studio is now run by her grandson, Tom Oppenheimer. It was not until his performance in Bang the Drum Slowly in 1973 that he was widely recognized as an excellent actor. Mean Streets, also in 1973, marked De Niro's first association with director Martin Scorsese, with whom he would do some of his most celebrated work. Director Francis Ford Coppola, whose film The Godfather in 1972 had won the Academy Award for Best Picture, was so impressed by De Niro in Mean Streets, he said, "Hey, we don't have to have a screen test. You're going to be Victor Corleone in The Godfather," and he was. Films with Scorsese included Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Goodfellas. Now, here's my another connection to Robert De Niro. It's Jerry Stiller in the middle. Those are my 2 kids. About 25 years ago, Jerry Stiller's my cousin. And of course, his son is Ben Stiller, named after my great uncle Benny in Brooklyn. So that's my other degree of separation from Robert De Niro, because he was in movies with Ben Stiller that included Meet the Parents, Meet the Fockers, and Little Fockers. And there is De Niro and Al Pacino. Al Pacino made his Broadway debut and won a Tony Award for his performance in the 1969 play, Does the Tiger Wear a Tie? Pacino's first leading role in a film came 1971, The Panic in Needle Park, a grim tale of heroin addiction. 1972, Coppola cast Pacino in the film that would make him a star, The Godfather. And there he is. He was in Scarecrow in 1973. He had roles in Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon. 1989, he comes back in The Sea of Love. In 2001, he gets the Cecil B. DeMille Award, Golden Globe for Lifetime Achievements. He also won the National Medal of Arts in 2011 and the Kennedy Center Honor in 2016. Henry Winkler probably made Sylvester Stallone's career. You don't believe me? Listen to Henry. 1974, Sylvester Stallone won his first critical acclaim as an actor for his co-starring role as Stanley Rosello in The Lords of Flatbush. Subsequently, he found some work as an extra or side character in films with a sizable budget until he achieved his greatest critical and commercial success as an actor and screenwriter, starting in 1976 with the role of the boxer Rocky Balboa. May have been based on the Bayonne Bleeder, Chuck Wepner. But it was the guy in the middle of this picture, there's Stallone, and to his left, your right, is Henry Winkler, Lords of Flatbush, that helped propel Sylvester Stallone to stardom. This is what Henry Winkler said. He gave me a script, and I took that script he wrote to ABC. Now, the studio wanted to move forward, even giving Winkler money to produce it. But then they said, we're going to change the writer. That's what Hollywood does. Winkler broke the news to his friend Sly, who begged him not to let that happen. You got to remember, Henry Winkler at this point is the Fonz. Biggest star on TV, probably. Up there with Archie Bunker, maybe Fred Sanford and Sanford's son, Red Fox. But he may be the biggest star in TV by this point. In an unprecedented move, Winkler offered to give the money back to ABC if they relinquished rights to the project. Studio initially balked at the idea, but Winkler used his clout as one of the most popular characters on television, the Fonz, to convince them. Now, because I was the Fonz, I had a little bit of playroom, and I convinced them to give me back the script. And I gave the script back to Sly, and he went on to become Rocky. There he is, the statue. The statue and the steps are two of the most popular attractions in Philadelphia. People gather at the bottom of the steps at the Philadelphia Museum of Art to snap a picture with the statue, originally created for a scene in Rocky III. And then he became the action star, Rambo, and he did all of those type movies, and he did Rocky V and all that other stuff. He was also in Staying Alive, which featured John Travolta, and that was a bomb. And there is Travolta, Saturday Night Live. His first major role was on a television sitcom called Welcome Back, Kotter in 1975, but oddly enough, there's no mention of Welcome Back, Kotter in his bio on his website. He was in Carrie, Saturday Night Fever, Grease, Urban Cowboy. His career declined. Came back in the 1990s with Pulp Fiction, Get Shorty, Broken Arrow, Phenomenon, Face Off, Civil Action, Primary Colors, Hairspray, and Bolt. Leonardo DiCaprio started on Romper Room, and he made commercials and educational films. He's one of the top actors in Hollywood. He could portray unconventional and complex characters. The director is Frank Capra. He was one of the busiest directors in the 1930s and 40s, and some of his movies, It Happened One Night, You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. His most famous, though, is It's a Wonderful Life. That's probably his best film. But it was a flop. It was a total flop, but the film found a second life after falling into public domain, where it began its yearly showings on TV during the Christmas season. James Stewart, Capra, maybe the best they did. He also directed the Private Snafu military cartoons during World War II, which are absolutely hilarious. And you can see them up on YouTube. They were classified. And the Snafu, anything that could go wrong, went wrong. And they are absolutely hilarious cartoons done in conjunction with Warner Brothers. Here's Coppola. He is best known for The Godfather, Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now. In 1970, he co-wrote the script for the movie Patton with Edmund H. North, and they won an Academy Award for the best original screenplay. Martin Scorsese. His films, Mean Streets, Taxi, New York, New York in the 70s. 1980s, Raging Bull, King of Comedy, Color of Money. 1990s, Goodfellas, Cape Fear, Casino. Turn of the century, Gangs of New York, The Aviator, The Departed. His films of the 20-teens, Shutter Island, Hugo, and The Wolf of Wall Street. Jay Leno. Well, he went to school at Emerson College in Boston, became a stand-up comic, local nightclubs, moved to LA, opening act for Johnny Mathis, and Tom Jones, who's still out there. Leno debuted on NBC's Tonight Show in 1977, became Johnny Carson's permanent guest host 10 years later. In 1992, NBC chose Leno over David Letterman to replace the retiring Carson. He was on the Tonight Show until May 29th, 2009. He continued in TV. And we leave with Lou Costello and Who's on First with Bud Abbott. Formula comedy, Who's on First, is an American classic. It's a type of vaudeville act that was a common style. It descended from the turn of the century burlesque sketches that used plays on words and names. Bud Abbott said it was taken from an older routine called Who's the Boss? 1993 obituary of comedy sketch writer Michael J. Musto states that shortly after Abbott and Costello teamed up, they paid Musto $15 to write the script. My friend Max Docelli, he's a comic, mostly on Waters, but probably plays up in your neck of the woods as well. And he broke in with Jerry Seinfeld and Gilbert Gottfried, Larry David, Paul Reiser, who was the first guy to make it big out of that group. Carol Leifler went on to cruise ships, and he's one of my best friends. And I said, hey, Max, you think Abbott and Costello ever paid Musto money? And he said, we're comics. We steal everything. Abbott's wife recalled him performing the routine with another comedian before teaming up with Costello. After formally they teamed up in burlesque in 1936, he and Costello continued to hone the sketch. It was a big hit in the fall of 1937. They went on a vaudeville review called Hollywood Bandwagon, and then finally debuted on the Kate Smith Show on March 24th, 1938. They may have gotten some help from John Grant and Will Glickman writing the bits. The routine had legs, performed at the White House, performed in the movies, also on radio and TV. Abbott and Costello were enshrined in baseball's Hall of Fame in 1956. Vin Scully, the Dodger announcer, was looking at his screen and he sees this picture and he tells the audience, now we know the answer to baseball's eternal question of who's on first. There is who. His name, Chin Lung Woo. He's from South Korea, made his debut with the Los Angeles Dodgers in the major leagues on September 1st, 2007 against the San Diego Padres. It ain't over until it's over. Not quite over yet. Mike Dyer got Yogi Berra to say that in 1973. Yogi was the New York Mets manager. And the Mets, as a team, had a lot of players on the injured list, but the players were coming back. The Mets were treading water. They were mediocre, but nobody in the National League East was any better. So they were still technically in the race, but couldn't lose too many games. If you started losing anything above one game, that's it. You're done. So the Mets are playing. And Mike Dyer, the late Mike Dyer, passed away a couple of years ago, a guy I knew for over 40 years. Anyway, Mike Dyer is with the Long Island Press, and it's a game at Shea Stadium. The team had just lost. All the writers assemble at a desk that surrounded Yogi, and you could hear a pin drop because after a loss, you hear pin drops or whatever. And Mike Dyer said to Yogi, Yogi, is it over? Yogi said it ain't over till it's over. And he was right. The Mets, his team, would go on to beat Cincinnati in the playoffs and would get into the World Series where they lost against the Cincinnati Reds. This is the last time I was with Yogi. That's Brian Cashman, the New York Yankees general manager. I do know that I'm talking to a group in Boston, so I should probably have clipped him out of the picture. Anyway, that was the last time I saw Yogi. Mike Dyer got him to say it, and it probably is his most famous saying, it ain't over until it's over. It's over. That's the last picture that I ever took with Yogi. Yogi's in the front row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in, and behind him with the black shirt is me. And that was it. That was the last team picture I ever took with Yogi. I want to thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank Les, and I want to thank the center for inviting me during the pandemic. So thank you so much, and hopefully in the future at some time, maybe we'll be able to talk again. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you for all the opportunities I've had speaking to you over the years, and hopefully somewhere down the road, we'll see you again. Bye bye, everybody.